Welcome, everyone, to episode number 73 of the For Animals, For Earth show, The Truth About Eggs. So, today we are talking about eggs, chickens, hens. I'm joined by Dr. Vicky Bond, who is the president of the Humane League. Hi, Vicky. Welcome.
So lovely to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to have you. I'm so excited for our conversation. If you are not familiar with the Humane League, it is a global nonprofit organization that works to end the abuse of animals who are raised for food. Dr. Vicky is a veterinarian. She's also an animal welfare scientist. She has been a vet tech since you were 14 years old. So I wanted to just quickly ask you about how did you get into loving and working with animals at such a young age?
Yes, I always loved animals. From this moment, yeah, there's not a time when I don't remember thinking I wanted to be a vet. I was just waiting to turn 14, honestly, and that's the age that the veterinary clinic that we used to take my cat to would allow you to start working there. So it was just like my 14th birthday. I'm 14 now. Who's gonna have a job?
That's amazing.
Yeah. So I used to work after school and then weekends, and yeah, loved it. Loved looking after animals. I've always just wanted to help animals, and it's corny, but that's the reality. And yeah, I felt at the time veterinary was the way to do that, helping the injured animals. But it was when I went to vet school and I started being exposed to industrial farming that I realized, oh, hang on, there's so many more animals that need helping than I could help in a veterinary clinic. And as time went on that course, I realized maybe I need to think more broadly about like what things could I do that would impact animals on a much larger scale than just working in a clinic. And that's when I did a master's in environment development and policy, which really helped broaden my perspective. And then I did some work on food justice and some other pieces, some lobbying. And then I got a job at the Compassion in Wild Farming to be a researcher. I saw this role and was like, oh, this is it. Like, this is the thing. The vet school that I went to had a zero grazing dairy herd, which this is quite a while ago now. We're talking
Uh-huh.
20 years ago. Yeah, so and that was quite new for then, where basically the cows never saw a blade of grass. They never went outside. And that was horrifying and really not what I think the industry portrays in terms of when you think about dairy, for instance. And so, yeah, when I saw this job at Compassion, I was like, fighting factory farming, this is what I want to do. The industrial system is horrific for so many reasons. And if I can play a part in that, using my veterinary skills as a way to improve conditions for animals, then I could impact many millions rather than just the one-to-one that I would do in a practice. So that's how I ended up where I am now.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, what a cool path and journey to kind of naturally lead you to where you're at now. And I saw a quote that I just thought was very simple and straightforward that you had said at some point, and it was simply, "Our food system is broken." And I think that you've alluded to that a little bit, but can you elaborate that on that more deeply and just help explain to us like why is the food system broken?
Yes. So the predominant industrial agricultural system as we see today prioritizes high yields and profits over everything else. So over human health, over environmental sustainability, over animal welfare, even over nutritional value. And this is using up lots of resources. It's also overusing chemical fertilizers, pesticides. There's monoculture, there's soil degradation, water pollution, loss of biodiversity. All of that is contributing to climate change. And animals in those systems are simply treated as products rather than the sentient beings that they are. And humans are also exploited. Some of the worst working conditions you will see on farms are found in animal farms and slaughterhouses. And we really only have to look at during COVID, Tyson, which is the second largest meat packing company on the planet, the largest poultry producer in the US, they had twice a number of people die, workers die from COVID during that time. They had thousands of cases because they don't care about people. They care about profits. They put that first. The conditions in these slaughterhouses are horrific for animals as well as they are for people. And so this current production system, this factory farming, as we call it, because that's what they are, they're factory farms. Companies are choosing profit over everything else. Animals are in confinement. They're on top of each other. They're injured. They're sick. Yeah, the food system is broken. It's driven by profit. And here at THL, at the Humane League, we're working to end the abuse of animals raised for food and try to mend that broken system. And we see working on some of the worst forms of cruelty as where we need to focus first, and that's ending cages for laying hens, both here in the US and around the world.
What makes that one of the worst forms of cruelty?
A number of reasons. So the laying hens, so if we start about what the system, how the system actually is set up.
That would be great. Even like maybe if you could give us like an overview of where do eggs, all the way from like the baby or the mom, I guess the chicken or the egg, and then all the way to an egg ending up on the table. I think that would be really helpful to just hear, and then into that more.
Yeah, absolutely. So people often don't realize that with this industrial, like factory farming, we have now genetically selected animals so that they can be as profitable as possible. So in the case of chickens, you have laying hens, which is why we call them laying hens, and you have chickens reared for meat or broiler chickens. Laying hens are female, they lay eggs. In that system, the birds lay eggs, and then those eggs either become hens that go on to lay eggs or male chicks. If they're a male chick, because they've been bred specifically to lay as many eggs as possible, so typically in the wild, a hen would lay a clutch of 12 eggs and she'd have a break, she'd rear those chicks, sorry. In this system, the way they've been bred now is that they lay an egg every day. They do that for their productive life. I say that because they could continue to go on, but the industry decides to slaughter them at a year of age when they start reducing their egg laying capacity. So the male chicks, instead of going on to be reared for meat, which I think often people think rightly that's probably what they do, they're killed, and they're killed at a day old as soon as they're hatched, and they're either ground up or they're gassed. It's horrific, and it's such I think it signifies just how much waste is in the system when birds can be reared and slaughtered at a day of age, like ground up, because they're not seem to have to have enough value for them to be worth living. And then so these chicks are reared, and they're called pullets at this stage. If they're going into a cage system, they will be in cages from the moment they've been hatched. And they'll be in these cages as pullets until they're about 18 weeks of age, or 16 to 18 weeks of age, so about 4 months or so. They will then go on to the laying hen farm, and that's when they start to lay eggs. So they become mature enough to lay eggs, and they'll go into cage systems. So these barren cages are so small that it's less than iPad's worth of space that these hens each have. You'll have 4 or 5 birds in a cage. They can't even spread their wings. Their feet are continuously on metal bars, and they sometimes peck each other to death. There is complete boredom. These are birds that are so sensitive that if you meet a chicken, they are inquisitive, they will want to be foraging. These are birds. We look around and you see what birds predominantly do, other than sort of flying and things, that they'll be looking for food. That's like their natural drive to do that. They can't do that on a metal floor. They have nothing there. They just have the feed that they can peck at, and that's it. And these birds will get sores on their feet. Their bones become so weak. So these birds are laying so many eggs that their body needs to find calcium. And if they don't have enough calcium from the food, which often they can't get enough from, they actually start taking calcium from their bones, which is why you see these birds not only having weaker bones because they're not moving, but also having these brittle bones because they're taking calcium to produce an egg a day.
Mm.
They'll be in these barren cages for their life until they get to about a year and a half of age. So they've been laying eggs for about a year. Now, one or two things could happen. They may go to slaughter. We can talk about slaughter in a minute, but also in this country, forced molting is still happening. And this is beyond horrific. This is when birds are starved of water and food for a number of weeks so that induces a molting phase. So in the wild, these birds would have winter. And when winter comes, like the rest of us, they want to hunker down and like not do things, including not having little chicks that are going to be at risk of freezing to death in the winter. So these birds will have this reduced period. And then when spring comes, they would start laying eggs again. It's a way of the body preserving resources and everything else. So in factory farming, what happens is they induce this molting phase by basically pretending there's a winter. They reduce the light levels, they reduce food, they reduce water. These birds dramatically lose weight. It's in these barren cages, they don't even get any food and water. And then they kick back in with the food and water, and what will happen is the egg production will go up much higher than it was when it petered off at the end. And so they can get another round of, I can't remember how many months, but a few more months of eggs from these birds before they go to slaughter. And that's about a third of the flocks that still happen in the US, I think, that still do this. It's banned in certain countries, like it's banned in Europe, in fact. And it's just adds to the harrowing life that these birds have to live in these cages. When they go to slaughter, the slaughter conditions are also problematic, very bad. They are water baths. These birds will be hung upside down by their very weak legs that are often broken as they try and get them out of the cages. They break their wings and legs. And then often, rather than having them stunned before slaughter, they will not be effectively stunned in the water bath and suffer the feeling of their throat being cut before they die. So it's a really horrific system.
Yeah.
It's also horrific for people that work on these systems. There's high levels of dust and dirt in these sheds with these cages. Birds obviously have feathers, and there's dust from that, plus all the excrement and everything that's on the cages. In the slaughterhouses, these workers are made to work in long conditions with very poor pay, typically no medical benefits. They're at risk from high machinery incidents and things like that. So it is a factory of farming, and that's why, back to your original question, why are we focusing on laying hens? Mm-hmm. The degree to which these animals suffer is so huge in these systems, mm-hmm. plus the long-termness of the suffering. So compared to other farm species, excluding salmon and other fish, but if we talk about terrestrial animals, like pigs and cows and that kind of thing, mm-hmm. they are living much longer in much more confinement than other species would. And so for this reason, we see this as one of the cruelest forms of factory farming on this planet, and one of the things that we want to dismantle first as we aim to try and fix this broken food system. Mm-hmm. And we are doing that. So at THL, we work to get companies to commit to higher welfare conditions for animals in their supply chain. And so this institutional change has a huge impact. These companies have a lot of power, and they can yield that power for good if they wanted to. And so we will meet with companies and ask them to change their supply chain to go cage-free. Some companies see the writing on the wall and they go for it, and that's great. And then other companies, unfortunately, don't see the incentive enough. And that's when we launch our campaigns against companies, and you will see us launching campaigns to highlight to the public, look at these systems that these companies are using in their supply chains. And whenever you show a person, they nearly always say, this is horrific, I don't want to be buying these products. I'm willing to pay more for products that means that hens don't have to suffer like this.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, I think to your point, it's like everybody wants to make things better, right? And as a consumer, at least. And I feel like the world of eggs has gotten confusing, to say the least, when it comes to being a consumer. Maybe it's to your point that everyone sees the writing on the wall and consumers are demanding more. And then therefore these new words pop up and these new labels. And it's like, what do they actually mean? And I also worry that people think they're doing well. I don't want to say they're doing well. People think that the label they choose means that the hen has a decent life, and the truth is usually not that case. I wonder if we can go through just like a quick vocab review because there are so many labels out there.
Yeah.
And I think it would be helpful to literally just run down a list of vocabulary words and
Yeah.
definitions for everybody of what they mean. So I know like four that I would like to hit on are cage free,
Mhm.
free range, pasture raised, and organic, and
Yeah.
then any others. So let's start with cage free. What does it mean to be cage free?
Yeah. So cage free is a fairly all-encompassing term because you could be free range and cage free. So bear that in mind as
Okay.
well. But cage free in and of its definition means that the birds are in a shed. They are no longer in cages of any form, but they are in barns. They tend to be sort of open indoor spaces. And this allows the birds to move around and forage on the floor. They'll have nest boxes. So one of the things, these birds are highly motivated to lay their eggs somewhere safe. They would do that in the wild, and they still have that real maternal motivation now. So they have nest boxes in these systems, which allows them to go in and find a kind of dark space where they feel relaxed to lay their eggs. They have perches because, again, laying hens have internal things that makes them want to go at night to perch up high, so they're away from predators. So having those perches, they can perch higher up and feel safe. So these are kind of key things that happen in cage-free systems. In the US, there are not really many regulations beyond like you're not in a cage that are required for cage-free, versus in Europe, there are very specific regulations in Europe that have specifications on space. However, in certain states here in the US, so let's take California, where I am right now, there are space allowances, there's requirements, particularly for like how much space hens should have and things. And that's great. And so in some states we have that, you know, we would love that to be federal at some point. But yeah, predominantly cage-free means out of a cage in a shed with areas for them to be able to move to have lay their eggs, perch and forage.
Okay, great. And then the downside to that is just the difference in standards, and there may be like too many birds for one barn or something like that.
Yeah, there's definitely potential that, as I go back to the original point about broken system and profit,
Yeah.
you know, the more hens you have in a shed, the more eggs you're going to get. That doesn't entirely work because after a certain point, the welfare and the conditions outweighs the profitability because the birds stop laying so many eggs because they're suffering. But unfortunately, they're selectively bred to really lay eggs over all things, including over their own bone density. So conditions have to get very bad for that to really be the case, hence them being able to lay eggs in barren cages. But yeah, it's definitely, if you can't remember anything else when you look for eggs, and if you're going to buy eggs and it says cage free, then that's the one you want to go for. If it doesn't say anything, and this is the key thing, I think, when you start looking at labels and then actually like comparing them, they often use imagery that implies this beautiful farm with pasture and these birds out in the green. And unless it says free range or pasture reared, that is absolutely not going to have been the case 100%. Okay. Like no one is ever going to not put pasture reared or free range on the or organic on the egg box if it wasn't going to have that. So if you start looking, you'll see like there's a chicken with little tufts of grass. It's like that's not actually true. So
Okay.
yeah, so really look out for the phrasing cage free on those eggs. It is super important.
Okay. All right. Awesome. So then you mentioned that free range kind of overlaps. Is there anything that's like a difference between cage free and free range?
Yeah, so with free range, it means the birds should have access to outdoors.
Okay.
Unfortunately, there are very few regulations around what that means. So you could have a shed with like a pop hole, just one little exit for the birds to get out of. And obviously, in a huge shed with thousands of birds, because there are thousands of birds in these sheds, that's not adequate enough. So, looking for labels, like third-party labels, is really important. And so pasture-fed, pasture-raised, sorry, eggs are probably the most humane, as those ones are third-party audited companies, and they have particular sets of standards to uphold, which means that birds get a certain amount of space. So if you look for certified humane pasture-raised labels, they ensure there's no more than 1,000 birds per 2.5 acres. So that means like 108 square feet per bird, basically, in the fields. So that's really important because it means they actually have space, because otherwise you could have free range and actually like very poor range, like how much space is there actually for these birds outside. So pasture raised is really great in terms of comparatively to the others. It also has its problems. None of these, none of these systems have the individuality of having, if you had like 3 or 4 hens in your house, you're going to know when a hen isn't feeling well, for instance, and needs care. But in these industrial systems, regardless if it's pasture raised or cage free, there are thousands of birds in a shed, and you're not going to be able to treat each bird as an individual. And that can be problematic for sure. So yeah, so it's more humane. There's no such thing really as humane,
Yeah.
but it's definitely better. And so if you're going to be buying eggs, yeah, I would look for that label.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's really helpful because to your point, it seems like it would be amazing to either be vegan, which a lot of our listeners are, or at least trying, and or maybe have your own, and then if you can't get around that, go pasture raised and on from there. And I I think I'm thinking I have two questions in my head that I want to ask you. Let me quickly wrap up. Is there any meaning to organic?
There is.
Okay.
Predominantly, it means that they're fed organic food and they're not using certain chemicals and that sort of thing. But it does also mean they should have access to outdoors. But again, there's not really regulations on how much that space is. It is predominantly in this country, in the US. It doesn't have the same like meaning as Europe. So if you're listening to this and you're in Europe, organic regulations are very strict on actual conditions for the animals as well, and how much space they have. And if I was talking about this in Europe, I'd say buy organic eggs, because they have much more space, even more space than free range hens, and higher welfare. It's like the highest level of welfare you're going to get. But
Okay.
here in the US, I would say pasture raised is more important from the certified humane than I
Okay.
would. So
Okay. It's so crazy thinking about how vastly different this is around the world and in different places. And I suppose it could be helpful in terms of giving you some benchmarks to be like, okay, these places are doing this, so let's try to get there. But then it also has to be insanely frustrating and difficult. And I mean, the work that you all do, I think let's get into that a little bit more, because you basically approach trying to make this problem better by working directly with with legislators, I know, but also with like corporate, these factory farm, like I don't know if owner is the right word, but the decision makers within the factory farms, and then also consumers. And something that I really like about, I don't know if you would call it the mission or the philosophy of the Humane League, but you talk about speaking to both people's like heads and minds, about why we may want to change this, which I feel like kind of moves through to getting to human beings and saying like, hey, like we all know this is atrocious. Like, what can we kind of do together? And I think it's a really cool way of just advocating for welfare. Um, when I know you mentioned you meet with different decision makers, and it sounded like a lot of people will agree to come to the table and meet with you. Not so much.
I would say probably the majority will agree to meet with us. Of that, a much smaller percentage, will agree to do what we're asking without us having to make some form of like active campaign to some degree, whatever that might look like.
Okay. So maybe then you can speak to what an active campaign is. And so when it moves into that step, what that means and what type of work you're doing in that way.
Yeah, we so when we meet with these companies, we will sit down and show them the visualization of all the things, because often so these companies range from, the biggest companies you can think of in the planet, like McDonald's or KFC, or the biggest food service companies like Sodexo and Compass that literally serve 100 million meals a day. And these companies, we'll meet with the executives or those working relatively high up within the company, because we want the ones that have the power to be the ones we're speaking to really understand the risk they're putting their company at from being exposed to to the public, seeing that they use these cruel practices. When we leave those meetings, depending on how they've gone, if the company then is like, we're actually not going to work on this, or we might work on it, but we're not going to tell you when. It's like, no, you need to be working on it now. We need to end in the US. We're asking for commitments so that companies stop using cages by the end of 2025, which is like a blink away now in some regards. So we started this work back in 2015, and back then, 6 or 7% of companies were 6 to 7% of hens were cage free in this country. Now we're at 40%, because we have worked with hundreds of companies in this country and thousands of companies around the world, part of the Open Wing Alliance, which I'll touch on in a minute, to go cage free, and they've started transitioning to those cage free commitments. And we've also got in state bans as well, like California's state ban came in to end cages for hens too. So our campaigns vary to some degree, but typically the main thing is to get the noise out that this company uses caged eggs, and this is what hens look like when they're in cages. And so we will use their logo and put some splatters of blood on it. We'll really show that this company is all about cruelty, right? That this company has been told, they know now, they have cruelty in their supply chain, and they're not willing to do anything about it. And we will elicit the thousands of volunteers that we have around this country, our supporters, who will take actions to hold this company accountable. So we use social media a lot, digital actions. We will write on Facebook pages, on TikToks, on Instagram, on like, you name it, we'll be there. We will get everyone to email these executives to say why they should be doing it. We generally want to make life difficult for these companies, so they realize like this is the easier route, is really going cage free. Like this is, you think it's not, but it is the easier route. And you also will, make your customers happy, because like as soon as we do protests, we do silent protests where we stand with posters, just visualizing like the eggs that the hens that are in those cages outside the companies. They don't like that, surprisingly, not too surprisingly, but they're peaceful protests, but it makes the impact. And often those managers, if we're in a restaurant for instance, the managers are just as horrified as the customers, right? So it's really about spreading the word, getting companies to see, we're going to make sure everybody knows what you're doing. And that typically, we ramp up, we have different levels of campaigning. We will start soft and get harder. And eventually the vast majority of the companies commit because we make life so difficult. It's just easier for them to work on their supply chain than it is to deal with us and our supporters.
Which is really cool.
Yeah, it's amazing. And so we founded the Open Wing Alliance back in 2015. And that is bringing together organizations from around the world. So we have over 100 organizations now around the world working to end cages worldwide. It's amazing. And the bringing together of all these advocates, we share information, we share resources, we share each other's lessons, mistakes, how we can do things better. We have our Fast Action Network that we bring together. So if you wanted to get involved, say, and you're listening to this and like thinking, how can I get involved? Our Fast Action Network is a great way to do that. So if you go to our website, humaneleague.org, and go to get involved, you'll see Fast Action Network. What that means is we call it Fast Action Network because it will literally take you 2 minutes a day to do the actions. It is writing on a company's Facebook, it's writing on Instagram, it's doing something on TikTok, it's, you know, writing an email, like a quick email off to an executive. It takes a matter of minutes, but the impact is huge when thousands of people do this around the world. So last year, Toridor, one of the largest companies in Asia, and they own an awful lot of subsidiaries around the world. We wanted them to commit to go cage-free globally. We launched that global campaign, and within a matter of months, they committed to go cage-free around the world.
Wow.
And so we have commitments from many companies now globally to go cage-free. Our current campaign, which is right, we're right in the thick of it right now, is against Jollibee. Jollibee is the fastest growing Asian restaurant company in the world. Here in the US, they own Smashburger, for instance. So these companies have this overarching parent company that often owns lots of other companies. We go back to the broken food system, and the bringing together a massive companies now that own so much of the supply chain, but that's another rant. But Jollibee are using over 586 million eggs every year. We're talking so many birds in cages, and we want them to commit to go cage-free in their entire supply chain around the world. So we have organizations around the world right now protesting at different locations depending on the brand in their country. And yeah, we'd love people to get involved if they can, to hold Jollibee accountable to going cage-free globally. It's so important, and it's part of the trend that's happening, and we can end cages within our lifetime, and we need to. Like, these birds are suffering every day in these systems, and millions, like here in the US alone, we're talking 400 million hens are in, are in systems. Now over 100 million are out of cages thanks to the work we've been doing. But we've still got nearly 300 million in cages that we have to free. Okay. So
wow. Yeah, it's amazing to think that with that extreme amount of suffering, we can just spend a couple minutes a day making a difference. And, one thing that I did want to mention too, that I picked up in reading your different reports, there was even a quote. It was, "Change takes time, transparency does not." So I wanted to speak to this because if anyone's listening and they're like, gosh, it's so extreme. Like, they can't, these brands, they can't change like that. Like, that's so hard. There's not enough profit. I think that at least what I pick up is that you're looking for people who are working to change and people who are transparently communicating that work instead of saying sure and then laying quiet or just laying quiet. It's like you want to see that everybody's working to make this, I don't want to say fix this problem because that's just one level, right? But make this better for the hens. So I want to know if you want to speak to that at all.
Yes. So when we got these commitments, particularly here in the US, where we got them several years ago, we started this work in 2015, right? So 8 years or however many go now. They've had many years to make these changes. And so why we're asking for transparency is it's very easy for companies to have this drop off their priority list. There's always different priorities, and we want to make sure it stays top of their priority and they reach that commitment. They took a lot of good press back whenever they made that commitment. But what is a commitment if you don't follow through, right? It's just a broken promise. And so we're holding companies accountable right now. And we're saying it's not 2025 yet. We know that. but we absolutely want to see that you're making progress. Like, what progress are you making here? Because your deadline is fast approaching.
Right.
If you're not paying attention, you're not going to make it. And so that's why it's so important. We have given these companies many years to make this transition, because yeah, it cannot happen overnight. I wish we could click our fingers and it be done. It takes investment, it takes changing a system, it takes learning a system. We know that. But companies are doing it. Companies you would never think of doing it. Like Nestle are now 100% cage free.
Awesome.
Like, that's not a company you necessarily think great about. But they did it. They did it. They put the time in, they dedicated that work to it, and now they're 100% cage free. So it is doable. We see companies doing it. You know, even some of the worst companies, I think, in the world, like McDonald's, for instance, are now 88% cage free currently, and they're heading towards that 100%. So it's so important for us to see how these companies are doing, because without that, we could risk getting to the end of 2025 and they're like, oh, we haven't reached it, and that's not good enough. So yeah, we have to keep the pressure on these companies, because without that, there's a good chance they will take the good press and then hopefully it dies away, but it won't. We're not willing to let that happen.
Right. Which, I mean, that's absolutely amazing. It's so cool that you guys are out there doing this all the time. I will link to some of the reports in the show notes so people can, if you're listening and you're interested in, oh, who are the good ones? Who are the bad ones? There's reports that list all of this. So I will link to those in the show notes and everybody can go dig in. I want to wrap up with, I always wrap up with the same thing on this show, which is I ask my guests to share one simple idea that anyone listening can do right now to help animals and the environment.
Yes, and I have two, because
Perfect.
you see a lot of people are maybe already not eating eggs, and that's wonderful. But reducing your consumption, switching to cage-free, making sure you look at those labels if you are going to eat eggs makes a huge difference. But also right now, reaching out to your legislator about the EATS Act. So you may have heard about it already, but the EATS Act is a roll-on from the King's Amendment before. It's an act that's been designed to wipe out state laws that ban the sale of products that are like the sale of caged eggs or veal or that kind of thing. So it's basically going to try and overturn a lot of legislation, not just for farmed animals, but also puppy mills or like the wildlife trade, or even on animal experiments for cosmetic testing. So we really want people to take action. Again, if you go to our website, the first thing that will come up is like act now, and you can reach out to your legislator and just say, like, please make sure this act does not come through. We know that we've passed the first hurdle, that the majority of senators and representatives refused to sign on to the original sponsors of this bill, which is a relief when it was tried to be introduced into Congress, but they're still pushing, they're still trying to find different angles now. And it's extremely important for upholding so many different pieces of legislation that we have in different states that are protecting people and animals and the planet. So reach out to your legislator now and tell them to stop this dangerous bill. That would be huge.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And we will link to resources for that as well. If anyone wants to get in touch with you or the Humane League, what's the best way to contact?
Yes, go to thehumaneleague.org. And there you can get involved, join our fast action network, as we talked about, those 2-minute actions, that's huge as well. And yeah, from there you can find lots of different information. We have lots of great pages on all different types of animal production, so you can learn more about the different systems. I'm a scientist, so I very much want to ensure it's scientific and it's not just, you don't need to make up how horrific factory farming is. It is real, it is horrific, but it's good to make sure that it's all like scientifically there, and we do have that, so you can learn a lot on our website too.
You really can. I mean, that's an understatement. And there is so much data, so much work. It's just incredible. So yes, everyone head over there. The show notes will also have links to everything that you can get to quickly. So thank you so much for joining me, for having this conversation, answering all the questions to help us all just understand this little part of the world a little more.
Thank you, Brandy. It's been great to have this chat. I really appreciate it.
Awesome. All right. See you all later.